The champagne glass slipped from my fingers, shattering against the marble floor of their pristine foyer. The sound echoed through the silence that had fallen over the Thanksgiving dinner table just moments before. My daughter-in-law Madison stood frozen in the doorway, her perfectly manicured hand still pointing toward the front door, her voice still ringing in my ears with those final, cutting words, "You just don't fit in here anymore, Bernice. Maybe it's time you found somewhere else to spend the holidays." Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. I stared at the sparkling fragments scattered across the floor, each piece reflecting the chandelier light like tiny diamonds. Fitting, I thought. Because what Madison didn't know, what none of them knew, was that I could buy 1,000 chandeliers just like theirs without even checking my bank balance. But instead of telling them that, I simply bent down, picked up the largest shard, and walked out of their house forever. My name is Bernice Kelly, though most people call me Bernie. I'm 73 years old, and if you saw me at the grocery store or walking my neighbor's dog, you'd probably think I was just another retiree living on Social Security and pension checks. You'd see my simple clothes from discount stores, my practical handbag, my sensible shoes. You might even feel a little sorry for me, this grandmother who clearly couldn't afford the finer things in life. And that's exactly what I wanted you to think. For the past 15 years, ever since my husband Frank passed away, I'd been living what most people would call a modest life. I drove a 10-year-old Honda Civic, shopped with coupons, lived in the same small ranch house Frank and I bought in 1978. My son Marcus and his wife Madison had grown accustomed to seeing me as the sweet but financially struggling mother who needed their help with everything from car repairs to medical bills. They'd learned to speak to me in that particular tone reserved for elderly relatives who couldn't quite keep up with the modern world. What they didn't know was that their poor, helpless mother had been quietly building an empire. It started 3 years after Frank died. I was 61, alone for the first time in my adult life, and desperate for something to fill the endless quiet hours. Frank had been a good man, a steady provider, but he'd handled all our finances with the philosophy that money should be saved, not invested. Our savings account had enough to keep me comfortable, but not much more. Or so I thought. One afternoon, while cleaning out Frank's old office, I found a box tucked behind his filing cabinet. Inside were stock certificates, bonds, and investment documents I'd never seen before. Frank, it turned out, had been quietly investing small amounts for decades. Nothing dramatic, nothing risky, just steady, patient investments in solid companies. When I took the papers to a financial advisor, I learned that Frank's modest investments had grown into something substantial. Not rich by some standards, but enough to change everything. That's when I made a decision that would alter the course of my entire life. Instead of telling Marcus about the inheritance, instead of moving to a nicer house or buying a newer car, I decided to learn. I spent the next 6 months reading everything I could about investing, about business, about money management. I took online courses, watched YouTube videos, attended seminars at the community college. And then, very quietly, very carefully, I began to invest. I started small. A few thousand here, a few thousand there. I bought stocks in companies I understood, businesses that made sense to me. I invested in real estate through REITs, in technology. Companies that were changing the world, in pharmaceutical companies developing treatments for diseases I'd watched ravage my friends. I wasn't gambling, I was learning, adapting, growing. The returns were modest at first, but consistent. I reinvested everything, living off Frank's pension and my small Social Security check while my portfolio grew. I learned about compound interest. Not from a textbook, but by watching my account balances climb month after month. I discovered I had an intuition for good investments, a patience that served me well in volatile markets, and a risk tolerance that surprised even me. By the time I turned 65, I was worth more than I'd ever imagined possible. By 70, I was what most people would call wealthy. By 73, I was rich enough to buy Madison's precious house 10 times over and still have money left for a yacht. But I never told anyone. Not Marcus, not Madison, not their children, not my friends. I kept driving the Honda, kept shopping at discount stores, kept living in my little ranch house. I told myself it was because I didn't want to change, didn't want people treating me differently. But if I'm being honest, part of me enjoyed the secret. Part of me liked knowing that when people looked at me and saw a struggling widow, they were seeing exactly what I wanted them to see. The irony wasn't lost on me. Marcus and Madison, with their massive mortgage and their credit card debt and their constant stress about money, looked down on me for being poor while I quietly accumulated more wealth than they could comprehend. They lived in a beautiful house they couldn't afford, drove luxury cars they'd financed at ridiculous interest rates, and sent their children to private schools that stretched their budget to the breaking point. all while treating me like a charity case. And I let them. For years, I let them. Marcus would slip me $100 for groceries, with the air of a benevolent son taking care of his aging mother. Madison would buy me clothes from discount stores for Christmas, always making sure to mention how she'd found such good deals, as if she were doing me a favor by acknowledging my poverty. When my old washing machine broke down, they insisted on buying me a new one, a basic model from the clearance section, while making it clear what a sacrifice this was for their family budget. I thanked them graciously every time. I played the role of the grateful, struggling mother perfectly. And all the while, I watched their marriage strain under financial pressure, watched them argue about money in hushed voices when they thought I couldn't hear, watched them make decision after decision that pushed them deeper into debt while they congratulated themselves on their success. The house was the perfect example. A sprawling colonial in an exclusive suburb, with 5 bedrooms, 4 bathrooms, and a mortgage that consumed more than half of Marcus's income. Madison had insisted they needed the space, needed the address, needed the status that came with living in Willowbrook Estates. Never mind that Marcus worked 60-hour weeks to afford it, never mind that they had no emergency fund, never mind that they were one missed paycheck away from disaster. They threw elaborate parties they couldn't afford, took vacations they charged to credit cards, bought their children everything they asked for while complaining privately about the cost. And through it all, they maintained the fiction that they were successful, established, financially secure. They needed to believe it, needed others to believe it, needed me to believe it. So I did. Or I pretended to. The truth was, I'd been watching their financial decline for years. Marcus had confided in me about his struggles, never realizing that his poor mother could have solved all his problems with a single transfer from one of her investment accounts. He'd told me about the second mortgage they'd taken out, about the credit card debt that kept growing, about the fights he and Madison had about money. And still, they treated me like I was the one who needed help. The breaking point came gradually, then all at once. It started with small slights, little comments that revealed how they really saw me. Madison would suggest I might be more comfortable staying home when they had certain guests over. Marcus would apologize for my outdated opinions when I spoke about current events. They began excluding me from family decisions, from planning discussions, from conversations about the future. I wasn't their beloved mother and grandmother. I was an embarrassment. A reminder of modest beginnings. They wanted to forget. A woman whose financial struggles made them uncomfortable, whose presence didn't match the image they wanted to project. The final straw came at my grandson Tyler's high school graduation party. Madison had planned an elaborate backyard celebration, complete with catered food, a DJ, and decorations that must have cost thousands. I arrived wearing my best dress, a simple navy blue outfit I'd owned for years, carrying a gift I'd chosen carefully. The party was in full swing when I walked into the backyard. Neighbors, teachers, Marcus's colleagues from his law firm, all mingling around tables covered in white linens and crystal glasses. I felt immediately out of place, not because of the elegance but because of the way conversations stopped when people noticed me. The way eyes quickly looked away, the way smiles became strained. I found Marcus near the bar, laughing with a group of men in expensive suits. When he saw me, his expression shifted almost imperceptibly. Not quite embarrassment, but something close to it. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "Mom," he said, his voice carrying just a hint of tension. "You made it." "Of course I made it," I replied, hurt that he seemed surprised. "It's Tyler's graduation." One of the men, someone I didn't recognize, looked me up and down with barely concealed disdain. "Marcus, you didn't tell us your mother was coming." The words hung in the air like smoke. Marcus shifted uncomfortably, glancing between me and his colleagues. "Oh, well, yes. Mom, these are some partners from the firm." No introductions, no proud "this is my mother" declarations. Just an acknowledgement that I existed, followed by an obvious attempt to steer the conversation away from me. I excused myself and found Tyler, handsome in his cap and gown, surrounded by friends and their families. When I approached to give him his graduation gift, he hugged me briefly but then quickly returned to his conversation. Even my own grandson seemed eager to move past our interaction. That's when I overheard it. Madison was standing with a group of other mothers, their voices low but not low enough. "It's so hard sometimes," Madison was saying. "Having family members who just don't quite fit in with where we are now. You know what I mean?" The other women nodded sympathetically. One of them glanced in my direction, then back to Madison. "It must be difficult for you." "It is," Madison continued. "We try to include her, but honestly, she doesn't understand our lifestyle. The way we live now. It's awkward for everyone. I stood there, frozen, holding my purse and feeling smaller than I had in years. This was how they saw me. Not as the woman who had raised Marcus, who had worked 2 jobs to help put him through college, who had loved him unconditionally through every triumph and failure. I was an inconvenience. A relic from a past they wanted to forget. I left the party early, making excuses about being tired. No one seemed disappointed to see me go. That night, I sat in my little kitchen, staring at my laptop screen and the investment portfolio that had grown beyond my wildest dreams. I owned stock in companies whose names were displayed prominently on Madison's designer handbags. I had enough money in my money market account to pay off their mortgage 3 times over. I could have written a check that would have eliminated every debt they had and still had millions left over. And they pitied me. But the real revelation came 6 months later, when I accidentally discovered just how deep their financial troubles really went. Marcus had called me on a Tuesday evening, his voice strained with stress. "Mom," he said, "I need to ask you something. And I don't want you to worry, but Madison and I are going through a rough patch financially." I listened as he explained their situation, each detail more devastating than the last. The second mortgage had an adjustable rate that had increased dramatically. Credit card debt had spiraled out of control. Marcus's law firm was going through its own financial difficulties, and his salary had been cut by 30%. They were behind on their car payments, their children's tuition, their property taxes. "We're looking at possibly losing the house," Marcus admitted, his voice breaking. "I hate to ask this, Mom, but do you have anything saved up? Anything at all that might help us get through this?" I sat there, listening to my son beg his poor mother for money she didn't have, while I looked at an investment account that had earned more in the previous month than he made in an entire year. The cruel irony was breathtaking. "Oh, sweetheart," I said, my voice carefully modulated to convey exactly the right amount of regret. "You know I would help if I could. But I'm just getting by myself." It wasn't entirely a lie. I was getting by. I was just getting by on dividends and capital gains that exceeded most people's salaries. That's when I realized I had a choice to make. I could continue playing the role of the struggling widow, watching my family suffer while I secretly accumulated wealth. I could reveal my financial success and risk changing every relationship I had. Or I could find a third option, something that would teach them exactly what they'd been throwing away while they chased their image of success. The plan began forming in my mind slowly, carefully, like one of the investment strategies I'd learned to love. It would require patience, precision, and perfect timing. But most importantly, it would require them to learn some hard truths about the woman they'd been so eager to dismiss. The opportunity came sooner than I expected, in the form of a Thanksgiving invitation that felt more like an obligation than a welcome. Madison called me on a cold November morning, her voice carrying that particular tone she used when she was forcing herself to be nice. "Bernice," she said, never Bernie, always Bernice, as if my nickname was too casual for her refined sensibilities. "We're planning Thanksgiving dinner at our house this year. Just family, nothing too elaborate." I could hear the reluctance in her voice, the way she was already setting expectations low to minimize any potential embarrassment I might cause. "That sounds lovely," I replied. "What can I bring?" "Oh, nothing," she said quickly. "We've got everything covered. Just bring yourself. Just bring yourself." As if even that was more than they really wanted. I spent the next week preparing for Thanksgiving, but not in the way Madison expected. I had my hair done at the most expensive salon in the city, not the discount place I usually went to. I bought a new outfit, nothing flashy but well-made, expensive in a way that didn't announce itself. I had my nails done, my eyebrows shaped, my makeup professionally applied. But most importantly, I made some phone calls. To my financial advisor, to my accountant, to my attorney. By the time Thanksgiving morning arrived, everything was in place. I drove to Marcus and Madison's house in my old Honda, parking behind their matching BMWs that were worth more than most people's annual salaries. The house looked perfect from the outside, as always. Perfectly manicured lawn, perfectly painted shutters, perfectly arranged seasonal decorations. Everything about it screamed success, prosperity, arrival. What it didn't scream was happiness. Or security. Or genuine contentment. I walked up the front steps, carrying a small gift bag, and rang the doorbell. When Madison answered, I could see her quickly assess my appearance, her eyes taking in the subtle improvements I'd made. She looked confused, as if she couldn't quite put her finger on what was different but knew something had changed. "Bernice," she said, her smile tight. "You look nice." "Thank you, dear," I replied, stepping into the foyer that had cost more than most people spent on cars. The house was exactly as I remembered it, beautiful, expensive, and cold. Everything was perfectly arranged, from the fresh flowers on the entry table to the art on the walls. It was a showplace, a symbol of success, a statement about who Marcus and Madison wanted the world to think they were. But I knew something they didn't know I knew. I knew about the second mortgage. That was strangling their budget. I knew about the credit cards that were maxed out. I knew about the fights they had late at night about money, about the stress that was eating away at their marriage, about the fear that kept Marcus awake staring at the ceiling. The dinner table was set for 8, Marcus and Madison, their 3 children Tyler, Emma, and Sophie, Madison's sister Catherine and her husband David, and me. The table itself was gorgeous, set with china and crystal that probably cost more than I spent on groceries in 6 months. Everything was perfect, elegant, expensive, and completely beyond their means. Dinner conversation was polite but strained. The adults discussed work, politics, travel plans for the holidays. The children talked about school, friends, plans for college. I listened mostly, contributing occasional comments that were politely acknowledged before the conversation moved on. I could feel it happening, the subtle exclusion, the way topics shifted when I tried to join in. When Catherine mentioned a vacation they were planning to Europe, I commented about a trip I'd taken there years ago with Frank. The conversation paused awkwardly before Madison changed the subject. When David talked about his new job in finance, I mentioned something I'd read about market trends. Emma rolled her eyes, and Tyler stifled a laugh. I was the elderly relative who didn't quite understand the modern world, whose opinions were outdated, whose presence was tolerated but not valued. They were kind about it, never openly rude, but the message was clear: I didn't belong in their sophisticated world. After dinner, while the women cleared the table and the men settled in the living room with cognac, I excused myself to use the restroom. But instead of going to the powder room, I walked upstairs to Marcus's home office. The door was open, and I could see stacks of bills on his desk, financial documents scattered across the surface. I didn't need to look closely to know what they contained: past due notices, credit card statements, loan documents. The debris of a lifestyle they couldn't afford. I was about to leave when I noticed something else: a real estate listing, printed from the internet. A smaller house in a less prestigious neighborhood, circled in red pen. They were already planning their escape from the dream home that had become a nightmare. When I came back downstairs, I found the family gathered in the living room. The children were on their phones, the adults were making polite conversation, and everyone looked like they were waiting for the evening to end. That's when Madison made her announcement. Actually, she said, her voice carrying that particular tone she used when she was about to say something unpleasant but wanted to sound reasonable. I've been thinking about next year. About holidays and family gatherings. The room got quiet. Even the children looked up from their phones. I think, Madison continued, glancing at Marcus for support, that it might be time for us to start doing holidays differently. Maybe smaller gatherings, more intimate. Just our immediate family. The words hung in the air like poisonous gas. Everyone understood what she was really saying: next year, I wouldn't be invited. Marcus looked uncomfortable but didn't contradict his wife. The children went back to their phones. Catherine and David studied their wine glasses with sudden fascination. I sat there for a moment, feeling the weight of the dismissal, the casual cruelty of it. These people, these financially desperate people who were drowning in debt while maintaining their facade of success, had decided that I was the problem with their family gatherings. That's when I decided it was time. I stood up slowly, setting down my wine glass on the coffee table that probably cost more than my car. Everyone looked at me, sensing that something was about to happen but not sure what. Madison, I said, my voice calm and clear. Can I ask you something? She nodded, though she looked wary. Do you really think I don't fit in here? The question caught her off guard. She glanced at Marcus, then back at me. I just think that sometimes it's hard when people are in different places in their lives. Different financial situations. Different financial situations, I repeated slowly. You think because I'm poor, I don't belong in your world. I didn't say poor, Madison protested, but her cheeks were flushing. You didn't have to, I replied. It's been clear for years how you see me. The struggling widow who needs your charity. The embarrassing mother-in-law who doesn't understand your sophisticated lifestyle. Marcus finally spoke up. Mom, that's not what she meant. Isn't it? I looked around the room, at all these people who had spent years treating me like a charity case. You think I don't understand money. You think I don't understand success. You think I'm just a simple old woman who can't keep up with your modern life. The room was completely silent now. Even the children had put down their phones. I reached into my purse and pulled out the gift bag I'd brought. Inside was a simple manila envelope, sealed and unmarked. I brought you a Thanksgiving gift, I said, holding out the envelope to Marcus. Open it. Marcus took the envelope reluctantly, his hands shaking slightly as he broke the seal. Inside were several sheets of paper, bank statements, investment summaries, property deeds. Marcus's face went white as he read. His hands began to tremble more noticeably. "Mom," he whispered. "What is this?" "Those are my financial statements," I said simply. "My real financial statements." Madison leaned over to look at the papers, and I watched her face transform as she read. Confusion, then disbelief, then something that looked like nausea. "The portfolio summary is on the second page," I continued. "The real estate holdings are on the third. The liquid assets are listed on the fourth." Marcus looked up at me, his face pale and confused. "I don't understand. This says you're worth, this can't be right." $12.7 million, I said calmly. "As of market close yesterday. It fluctuates, of course, depending on how my investments perform." The silence in the room was deafening. I could hear the grandfather clock ticking in the hallway, could hear someone's breathing, could hear my own heartbeat. "But you," Madison stammered, "you live in that little house. You drive that old car. You shop at discount stores." "Because I choose to," I replied. "Because I'm not interested in impressing people with my money. Because I learned a long time ago that the people worth knowing don't care what you drive or where you shop." I looked around the room again, at their shocked faces, their obvious confusion. "You want to know what I've been doing for the last 15 years while you've been treating me like a charity case? I've been building wealth. Real wealth. Not the kind that requires you to mortgage your future to maintain appearances. Not the kind that keeps you awake at night worrying about payments. Not the kind that forces you to choose between your children's education and your mortgage." I could see Marcus and Madison exchange a glance, and I knew they were thinking about their own financial struggles, their own midnight conversations about money. "I know about the second mortgage," I continued. "I know about the credit card debt. I know about Marcus's salary cut and the real estate listings on your desk upstairs. I know you're considering selling this house because you can't afford it anymore." Madison's face crumpled. "How do you know about that?" "Because you're my son," I said to Marcus. "Because I pay attention. Because I care about your family even when you make it clear I don't belong in it." I picked up my purse and walked toward the foyer. Everyone followed me, like they were in a trance. "The irony is breathtaking," I said, turning back to face them. "You've spent years looking down on me for being poor while you've been drowning in debt. You've excluded me from your lives because I didn't fit your image of success while you've been one missed paycheck away from bankruptcy." I paused at the front door, looking back at this family that had made me feel so small, so unwanted, so irrelevant. "You're right about one thing, Madison," I said. "I don't fit in here. I don't fit in with people who value appearances over authenticity. Who measure worth by debt-financed possessions, who treat family members like embarrassments to be managed." I opened the door and stepped onto the front porch, then turned back one more time. "Oh, and Marcus? When you're ready to have an adult conversation about your financial situation, call me. I might be willing to help. But first, you'll need to decide whether you want a relationship with your mother or with your idea of what your mother should be." That's when Madison said it. The words that would end everything between us. "You just don't fit in here anymore, Bernice. Maybe it's time you found somewhere else to spend the holidays." I looked at her for a long moment, this woman who had just discovered that the person she'd been pitying for years was worth more than she could comprehend, and she was still trying to exclude me from her life. That's when I dropped the champagne glass. Not accidentally, but deliberately. I let it slip from my fingers and watched it shatter against their expensive marble floor, the sound echoing through their financially precarious palace like a gunshot. Then I walked away from their house, their debt, their desperate pretensions, and their toxic version of family forever. The next morning, I woke up in my modest bedroom feeling something I hadn't experienced in years: absolute clarity. The sun was streaming through my simple cotton curtains, illuminating the room that Madison had always viewed with such barely concealed pity. The same room where I'd spent countless nights planning investment strategies that had made me wealthier than anyone in my family could imagine. I made my coffee in the same basic kitchen where I'd been living while my portfolio grew by hundreds of thousands of dollars. I sat at the same scratched wooden table where I'd been reading financial reports and making decisions that had transformed me from Frank's widow into a woman of independent means. Everything was exactly the same as it had been yesterday morning, except for one crucial difference: I was done pretending. The phone started ringing at 8:30. Marcus, of course. I let it go to voicemail. Then Madison called. Then Marcus again. By noon, I had 17 missed calls and a dozen text messages, each one more desperate than the last. "Mom, please. Call me back. We need to talk. Bernice, I think there's been a misunderstanding. Mom, I'm coming over." But I wasn't ready to talk to them yet. I had other things to do first. I drove my trusty Honda to downtown Chicago, to the offices of Whitman and Associates, the investment firm that had been managing my portfolio for the past decade. James Whitman himself greeted me in the marble lobby, just as he had every month for years when I came in for our regular meetings. "Bernie," he said warmly, using the nickname that Madison had always found too common. "Right on time as always." James was one of the few people who knew the truth about my financial situation. He'd been Frank's advisor first, then mine, and he'd watched my modest inheritance grow into something extraordinary. He'd also watched me maintain my simple lifestyle while my wealth accumulated, and he'd never once questioned my choices. "I need to make some changes, James," I said as we settled into his corner office overlooking the Chicago River. "Of course. What did you have in mind?" I pulled out a legal pad where I'd been making notes since 5 this morning. "I want to liquidate some assets. I want to make some purchases. And I want to establish a trust." James nodded, pulling out his own notepad. "Tell me what you're thinking." Over the next 2 hours, I outlined my plan. It was comprehensive, strategic, and designed to accomplish several goals at once. First, I wanted to secure my own future in a way that reflected my actual financial status, not the image I'd been maintaining. Second, I wanted to help my family, but on my terms. And third, I wanted to ensure that no one would ever again mistake my choices for limitations. "The trust is interesting," James said when I finished. "Educational expenses for the grandchildren, with performance requirements. They maintain a B average or better, they get full tuition. They slack off, the money goes to scholarship funds for underprivileged students." Exactly. I want them to understand that money comes with responsibility. That privilege requires effort. "And the other purchases?" I smiled. "Those are for me. I'm 73 years old, James. I've been living like a pauper while accumulating wealth like a queen. I think it's time I started enjoying both." When I left James's office, the wheels were already in motion. By the end of the week, my new reality would be impossible to ignore. I drove home to find Marcus sitting on my front porch, looking haggard and confused. He'd clearly been there for a while, judging by the coffee cup from the gas station down the street and the way he jumped up when he saw my car. "Mom," he said, hurrying toward me as I got out of the Honda. "We need to talk." "I imagine we do," I replied calmly, walking past him to unlock my front door. He followed me inside, into the small living room that had always made Madison uncomfortable. The furniture was old but comfortable, the decorations simple but meaningful. Nothing expensive, nothing flashy, nothing that would suggest the woman who lived here had millions of dollars in investment accounts. "I don't understand," Marcus said, sitting heavily on my couch. "Those papers you showed us last night. They can't be real." I went to my kitchen and put the kettle on for tea, giving myself time to think. Through the window, I could see Mrs. Patterson next door working in her garden, the same neighbor who'd been bringing me homemade soup for years because she worried I couldn't afford good food. "They're real," I said finally, returning to the living room. "Every number, every account, every investment." "But how? Dad didn't leave you that much money." "Your father left me enough to get started. The rest, I built myself." Marcus stared at me like I was speaking a foreign language. "You built it? Mom, you're a retired secretary." "I was a secretary," I corrected. "For 37 years. And during those 37 years, I learned quite a bit about business, about finance, about how money actually works. More than you might expect." The kettle whistled, and I went to make tea. When I came back, Marcus was holding one of my financial magazines, looking at it like he'd never seen it before. "I thought these were Frank's," he said. "Some of them were. The newer ones are mine. I've been subscriptions to Financial Weekly, Investment Quarterly, and Forbes for the past 12 years. You read Forbes?" "Every issue." I also read the Wall Street Journal, Barron's, and Harvard Business Review. I attend investment seminars, take online courses, and meet monthly with my financial advisor. I sat down across from him, noting his obvious shock. "Just because I choose to live simply doesn't mean I think simply." Marcus set down the magazine and looked around the room with new eyes. I could see him noticing things he'd overlooked before: the expensive laptop on my desk, the multiple monitors I used for tracking investments, the bookshelf filled with financial and business texts. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked, and for the first time since he'd arrived, he sounded like my son instead of Madison's husband. "Tell you what? That I was learning to manage money? That I was making investments? That I was becoming financially independent? Tell me that you were rich." I considered the question seriously. "Because you never asked. Because you made assumptions about what your poor, widowed mother could and couldn't do. Because you decided what role I should play." in your life, and that role didn't include being financially successful. That's not fair. Isn't it? I sipped my tea, watching my son grapple with a reality that contradicted everything he thought he knew about me. Marcus, when was the last time you asked me about my investments? My finances? My plans for the future? He was quiet for a long moment. I thought you didn't have any investments. Because you never asked. You assumed that because I drive an old car and live in a small house, I must be struggling. You assumed that because I don't spend money on expensive clothes or jewelry, or vacations, I must not have money to spend. But you let us help you, he protested. You let us buy you that washing machine. You let me give you money for groceries. I let you feel useful, I corrected. I let you feel like good children, taking care of their aging mother. But I never asked for help, Marcus. You offered it, and I accepted it because it made you feel better about yourselves. The truth of that statement hung between us like a bridge neither of us was sure we wanted to cross. The washing machine, Marcus said slowly. You could have bought a dozen washing machines. I could have bought the store that sold the washing machine. He laughed, but it sounded more like a sob. Jesus, Mom. We've been treating you like a charity case. You've been treating me like what you expected me to be. There's a difference. Marcus stood up and walked to the window, staring out at the modest neighborhood where his wealthy mother had chosen to live. Madison is going to be mortified. Madison is going to be angry, I corrected. There's a difference between being embarrassed by your mistake and being angry that someone didn't correct it for you. She feels terrible about what she said last night. Does she? Or does she feel terrible about who she said it to? Marcus turned back to me, his face troubled. She called me this morning crying. She said she couldn't believe she'd been so rude to someone who could buy our house 10 times over. And there's the difference, I said. She's not sorry she was rude to me. She's sorry she was rude to someone with money. If I were actually the struggling widow you thought I was, would she be calling you crying this morning? Marcus didn't answer, but we both knew the truth. I want to help, he said suddenly. With your financial situation, I mean. Our financial situation. I'd been expecting this. What kind of help? You know about the house. About our problems. If you could loan us something, just to get us through this rough patch. How much do you owe? Marcus sat back down, his shoulders slumping. Total? Between the mortgages, the credit cards, the car loans, the kids' tuition, probably. Close to $800,000. $800,000. It was less than I'd made in dividends the previous quarter. And you want me to loan you the money to pay it off? If you could. I know it's a lot, but we'd pay you back. With interest. Whatever terms you think are fair. I set down my teacup. And looked at my son, this man I'd raised and loved and supported through every challenge of his life. This man who was drowning in debt while maintaining the pretense of success. This man who'd spent years allowing his wife to exclude me from family events because I didn't fit their image. Marcus, I said gently, what makes you think you could pay me back? You can't pay back the debts you already have. His face flushed. We've had some setbacks. The economy, my salary cut, some unexpected expenses. The economy didn't force you to buy a house you couldn't afford. Your salary cut didn't make you lease 2 luxury cars. Unexpected expenses didn't create $800,000 in debt. We made some mistakes, he admitted. You made choices. Choices based on wanting to appear successful rather than actually being successful. Choices based on impressing people rather than building security. Choices based on the assumption that your mother was too simple to understand the difference. Marcus was quiet for a long time, staring at his hands. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. We're going to lose everything, aren't we? Not everything, I said. You still have your family. You still have your health. You still have your career, even if it's not as lucrative as it once was. You still have time to make better choices. But the house. The house is killing you financially. The house is the reason you work 60 hours a week and still can't make ends meet. The house is the reason you and Madison fight about money constantly. Maybe losing the house would be the best thing that ever happened to you. Madison will never agree to that. Then Madison will have to decide what's more important, her pride or her family's financial survival. I stood up and walked to my desk, pulling out a folder I'd been preparing since my meeting with James. I'm not going to pay off your debts, Marcus, I said, handing him the folder. But I am going to help you. On my terms. Marcus opened the folder and found several documents inside. The first was a deed to a house I'd purchased that morning. A comfortable 4-bedroom colonial in a good school district, but not a prestigious one. The second was a business plan for a financial counseling service. The third was an educational trust for Tyler, Emma, and Sophie. I bought you a house, I said as Marcus stared at the papers. It's yours, free and clear. No mortgage, no payments. It's not as big as the house you have now, and it's not in Willowbrook Estates, but it's in a good neighborhood with good schools, and you'll never have to worry about losing it. Mom, I can't accept this. You can and you will. Because your children deserve a stable home, even if their parents made poor financial decisions. Marcus looked at the second document. What's this business plan? I'm funding a financial counseling service. You're going to run it. You'll help families avoid the mistakes you made, help them understand the difference between appearing wealthy and building wealth. You'll make a decent living, nothing extravagant, but enough to support your family without going into debt. And the trust? College funds for the kids. Full tuition to any accredited university, as long as they maintain AB average or better. If they don't, the money goes to scholarship funds for kids whose parents can't afford college at all. Marcus was crying now, tears streaming down his face as he read through the documents. Why? He asked. After everything we've done, everything Madison said. Because you're my son. Because those children are my grandchildren. Because family means something, even when it's imperfect. What about Madison? She's going to hate this. All of it. Madison is going to have to decide who she wants to be. The woman who's grateful for a chance to rebuild her family's financial security, or the woman who's angry that it's not happening on her terms. Marcus wiped his eyes and looked at me with something I hadn't seen in years, respect. I don't deserve this. Probably not, I agreed. But your children do. And maybe, if you're willing to learn from your mistakes, you can become the kind of man who does deserve it. We talked for another hour, going through the details of the transition, the expectations I had, the changes that would need to be made. Marcus would have to sell the Willowbrook house, would have to give up the luxury cars, would have to completely restructure the way he thought about money and success. Most importantly, he would have to go home and explain everything to Madison. She's not going to take this well, he said as he prepared to leave. Probably not. But that's between you and her. I've done what I can for your family. What you do with it is up to you. After Marcus left, I sat in my quiet living room, surrounded by the simple furnishings and modest decorations that had been my choice, not my limitation. Tomorrow, I would start the process of moving into the penthouse apartment I'd purchased, overlooking Lake Michigan. I would start driving the new car I'd ordered. I would start living like the wealthy woman I'd become. But tonight, I was content to sit in the home where I'd discovered my own strength, where I'd learned that true security comes not from what others think of you, but from what you know about yourself. The phone rang again. Madison this time. I looked at the caller ID and made a decision that would have been unthinkable just 24 hours ago. I didn't answer. For the first time in 15 years, Madison would have to figure out how to solve her problems without expecting me to make it easier for her. For the first time in 15 years, she would have to consider that maybe, just maybe, she'd misjudged the quiet woman she'd been so eager to exclude from her perfect life. The next few days passed in a blur of activity that felt like waking up from a very long sleep. I spent Tuesday morning at a luxury car dealership, trading in my faithful Honda for a Mercedes that was elegant but not ostentatious. The salesman couldn't hide his surprise when I paid cash, clearly wondering how this simply dressed elderly woman could afford a car that cost more than most people made in a year. Wednesday, I met with a real estate agent to finalize the purchase of my new apartment. The penthouse had floor-to-ceiling windows, hardwood floors, and a view of Lake Michigan that took my breath away. It also had 3 bedrooms, a gourmet kitchen, and enough space to entertain if I chose to. The agent kept asking if I was sure about the purchase, clearly concerned that I might be making a mistake I couldn't afford. Thursday, I went shopping. Not at the discount stores where I'd been buying clothes for years, but at the elegant boutiques where women like Madison shopped. I bought clothes that fit properly, that were made from quality fabrics, that made me look like the successful woman I'd become. Nothing flashy or inappropriate for my age, but nothing apologetic either. Throughout all of this, my phone continued to ring. Marcus called daily, usually to update me on his conversations with Madison or to ask questions about the house and the business plan. Madison called less frequently, but when she did, her messages were carefully worded attempts to repair the damage she'd done. Bernice, I hope you know how sorry I am about Thanksgiving. I was stressed about money, and I took it out on you. Please call me back so we can talk. But I wasn't ready to talk to Madison yet. I was still processing the 15 years of subtle dismissals, the countless times she'd made me feel unwelcome in my own son's home, the way she'd turned my grandson's graduation party into an exercise in exclusion. The breaking point came on Friday afternoon. I was in my new apartment, directing the movers who were bringing in furniture I'd selected to match my actual lifestyle rather than my assumed limitations, when my phone rang. Emma, my middle granddaughter. Grandma Bernie? Her voice was small, uncertain. Hello, sweetheart, I said, stepping onto the balcony where I could talk privately. Mom said I should call you. She said you might not want to see us anymore. Because we hurt your feelings. I closed my eyes, feeling a familiar anger rise in my chest. This was exactly what Madison would do, use the children as emotional leverage, make them responsible for fixing the mess she'd created. Emma, honey, I will always want to see you. You and Tyler and Sophie are the most important people in my life. But Mom said you're really rich and you were just pretending to be poor, and now you're mad at us for not knowing. Your mother is wrong about a lot of things, I said carefully. I was never pretending to be poor. I just wasn't showing off my money. There's a difference. Are you really rich though? I looked out at the lake, at the boats dotting the water, at the city spreading out below me. I have enough money to take care of myself and help the people I love. What's more important is that I earned it honestly and I use it responsibly. Mom's been crying a lot, Emma said quietly. She keeps saying she ruined everything. Your mother made some mistakes, I said. But that doesn't mean everything is ruined. Sometimes when we make mistakes, we get a chance to do better. Are you going to come to Christmas? Mom said she wants to invite you, but she's scared you'll say no. There it was. The real reason for Emma's call. Madison was too proud to call me herself, too embarrassed to face the consequences of her actions directly, so she'd sent my granddaughter to do it for her. Emma, I want you to listen to me very carefully, I said. I love you and your brother and sister more than anything in the world. Nothing that happened between me and your parents will ever change that. But your mother needs to decide if she wants a relationship with me because she values me as a person, or because she found out I have money. I don't understand. I know you don't, sweetheart. And you shouldn't have to. This is something the adults need to figure out. After I hung up with Emma, I sat on my new balcony, looking out at a view I could afford but had never allowed myself to enjoy. The conversation with my granddaughter had crystallized something for me. This wasn't just about Madison's treatment of me, or even about money. It was about the example we were setting for the children. Tyler, Emma, and Sophie had spent years watching their mother treat me with polite disdain. They'd learned that family members could be dismissed if they didn't meet certain standards of success or sophistication. They'd absorbed the lesson that appearances mattered more than character, that financial status determined social worth. If I simply forgave Madison and pretended nothing had happened, what message would that send? That poor treatment was acceptable. As long as you apologized after discovering your target had power? That family meant nothing unless there was money involved? But if I cut off contact entirely, the children would suffer for their parents' mistakes. They would lose their grandmother over adult conflicts they didn't understand and hadn't created. I needed a third option. Something that would repair the relationship while making it clear that things had fundamentally changed. Saturday morning, I called Marcus. I want to have Christmas dinner, I told him. At my new apartment. For the whole family. Mom, that would be amazing. Madison will be so relieved. I'm not finished, I said. There are conditions. Marcus was quiet, waiting. First, this is not an apology dinner. I'm not hosting to make anyone feel better about what happened. I'm hosting because I want to see my grandchildren and because I want to establish new traditions based on honesty instead of pretense. Okay. Second, if Madison wants to come, she needs to call me herself. Not through you, not through the children, not through anyone else. She needs to have an adult conversation about what happened and what she wants going forward. I'll tell her. Third, we're going to talk openly about money, about choices, about the difference between living well and living beyond your means. I'm not going to pretend to be poor anymore, and you're not going to pretend to be rich anymore. The children deserve to understand how money actually works. That might be hard for Madison. Then Madison needs to decide what's more important. Her pride or her family. Marcus sighed. I'll talk to her. Marcus, I said, my voice softening. I love your family. All of you, including Madison. But I won't go back to being treated like a charity case. I won't go back to being excluded from conversations or dismissed because I don't fit someone's idea of sophistication. If we're going to rebuild our relationship, it has to be based on mutual respect. I understand, Mom. And I think this might actually be good for us. All of us. After we hung up, I spent the rest of the weekend preparing for Christmas dinner. Not just the practical preparations, but the emotional ones. I was about to host my family in a space that reflected my actual life rather than the image I'd maintained for their comfort. They would see me in my element, surrounded by the luxury I'd earned but hidden. More importantly, we would finally have honest conversations about money, about values, about the choices that had led us all to this point. Sunday evening, my phone rang. Madison. Bernice, she said, her voice formal and nervous. Marcus said you'd like me to call. I would, I said, settling into the chair by my window with a cup of tea. I owe you an apology. Several apologies, actually. Yes, you do. She was quiet for a moment, clearly expecting me to make this easier for her. When I didn't, she continued. I was wrong about you. About everything. I thought. I assumed. You assumed I was poor, unsophisticated, and embarrassing. You assumed I didn't understand your world or deserve a place in it. You assumed you could exclude me from family events without consequences. Yes, she said quietly. All of that. Why? I don't know. Because you lived simply? Because you didn't spend money on expensive things? Because I was so worried about appearing successful that I couldn't see past the surface? Those are reasons, Madison. I want to know why it mattered to you. Another long pause. Because I was insecure. Because I grew up without money, and I was so afraid of going back to that. Because I thought if we surrounded ourselves with the right things, lived in the right neighborhood, looked successful enough, we could outrun my fear of being poor again. It was the most honest thing Madison had ever said to me. And you saw me as a reminder of what you were trying to escape? Yes, she whispered. I'm so ashamed. Good, I said. You should be ashamed. Not because you grew up poor, but because you forgot where you came from. Not because you wanted security, but because you chose debt over actual financial stability. Not because you misjudged me, but because you treated me badly based on that misjudgment. Madison was crying now. I could hear it in her voice. I don't know how to fix this. You start by being honest. With me, with your children, with yourself. You start by admitting that the life you've been living isn't sustainable and isn't making you happy. Marcus told me about the house you bought us. About the business. I don't know what to say. Don't say anything yet. Just think about what kind of life you want to build going forward. Think about what you want to teach Tyler, Emma, and Sophie about money, about family, about treating people with respect regardless of their financial status. Will you? Can you forgive me? I can forgive you, I said. But I won't forget. This relationship is going to be different going forward, Madison. I'm not going to pretend to be someone I'm not to make you comfortable. I'm not going to hide my success to spare your feelings. And I'm not going to tolerate being treated as less than equal in my own family. I understand. Do you? Because this isn't just about money, Madison. This is about respect. This is about valuing people for who they are, not what they appear to be. This is about raising children who understand that worth isn't measured in dollars. I know. I want to do better. I want to be better. Then you're invited to Christmas dinner. At my new apartment. And we're going to start over, based on honesty instead of assumptions. As I hung up the phone, I realized that for the first time in 15 years, I was looking forward to spending the holidays with my family. Not because I was hoping they would accept me, but because I was finally ready to be myself whether they accepted me or not. The difference, I was learning, was everything. Christmas morning arrived with fresh snow covering Chicago, transforming the city into something magical from my penthouse windows. I stood in my kitchen, preparing dinner in a space that finally matched my capabilities rather than my pretense. The marble countertops, professional-grade appliances, and panoramic view of Lake Michigan created an atmosphere of quiet elegance that felt authentically mine for the first time in decades. At 10 o'clock, Tyler called to wish me Merry Christmas. My oldest grandson's voice carried a warmth I hadn't heard in years, free from the awkward distance that had characterized our recent interactions. Grandma Bernie, Mom showed us pictures of your new place. It looks incredible. Thank you, sweetheart. I'm looking forward to you seeing it in person today. Can I ask you something? Dad tried to explain about the money and the investments. But I don't really understand. Were you always rich? I smiled, appreciating his directness. I became financially comfortable over time, Tyler. Through patience, learning, and making good decisions with the money your grandfather left me. But Tyler, remember that being wealthy isn't about the amount you have. It's about making smart choices with whatever amount you do have. Mom and Dad have been talking differently about money lately. Dad said we might be moving to a different house. How do you feel about that? Tyler was quiet for a moment. Honestly? I think it might be good. This house always felt like we were trying too hard, you know? Like we were pretending to be something we weren't. The wisdom in his observation struck me. Even as a teenager, Tyler had sensed the financial strain his parents had been under, the artificial nature of their lifestyle. Your parents are learning to make better choices, I told him. Sometimes that means changing how we live, but it doesn't mean changing who we are. After we hung up, I continued my preparations, setting the table with china I'd selected myself. Rather than inherited or bought on sale. Each plate, each glass, each piece of silverware reflected choices made from abundance rather than limitation. The table looked elegant but welcoming, sophisticated but warm. At 2 o'clock, I heard the elevator arrive at my private floor. Through the security monitor, I watched my family step into the hallway, their faces reflecting awe as they took in the luxury of the building. Marcus carried a bottle of wine, Madison held a bouquet of flowers, and the three children clustered together, clearly overwhelmed by their grandmother's new environment. I opened the door before they could knock, greeting them in the foyer that showcased art I'd carefully selected and furnishings that spoke to my actual taste rather than my budget constraints. "Welcome to my home," I said simply. Emma was the first to speak, her eyes wide as she looked around. "Grandma, this is like something from a movie." "It's beautiful, Mom," Marcus said, his voice carrying a mixture of pride and bewilderment. Madison stepped forward, offering the flowers with hands that trembled slightly. "Thank you for inviting us, Bernice. Thank you for giving us another chance." I accepted the flowers graciously, noting that for the first time in years, Madison had chosen an arrangement that reflected thoughtfulness rather than obligation. "These are lovely, Madison. Come in, all of you." As they followed me into the main living area, I watched their reactions to the space I'd created. The apartment was luxurious but livable, expensive but not ostentatious. Everything spoke to quality, permanence, and careful consideration. Most importantly, it spoke to a woman who valued herself enough to live well. Sophie, my youngest granddaughter, wandered to the floor-to-ceiling windows. "Grandma, you can see the whole city from here." "I can," I agreed, joining her at the window. "I like to sit here in the mornings with my coffee and watch the world wake up." "It must be lonely, living in such a big place by yourself," Madison said, though her tone suggested genuine concern rather than criticism. "I'm not lonely," I replied. "I'm peaceful. There's a difference." We gathered in the living room, where I'd arranged comfortable seating that encouraged conversation. For the first time in years, I felt like the hostess rather than the guest in my own family gathering. "Can I show you something?" I asked, retrieving a photo album I'd prepared specifically for this day. The album contained pictures I'd taken over the past 15 years, documenting not my financial journey but my personal growth. There were photos from investment seminars I'd attended, trips I'd taken alone to research companies I was considering investing in, meetings with financial advisors and business leaders. There were pictures of me at charity events I'd supported anonymously, at continuing education classes I'd enrolled in, at cultural events I'd attended while they assumed I was home watching television. "You went to the Chicago Symphony?" Emma asked, pointing to a photo of me in an evening gown outside Orchestra Hall. "Season tickets," I confirmed. "For the past 8 years." Tyler studied a picture of me shaking hands with a woman in a business suit. "Who's this?" "That's Patricia Hendricks, the CEO of Meridian Pharmaceuticals. I've been an investor in her company for 6 years. We have lunch every quarter to discuss market trends." Marcus looked up from the album, his expression thoughtful. "Mom, you've been living a completely different life than we thought." "I've been living my actual life," I corrected. "You've been seeing the version you expected to see." Madison turned a page and found photos from a financial conference in New York. "You spoke at this?" "I was on a panel about retirement investing strategies for widows." Turns out, my experience resonating with other women who found themselves managing money for the first time later in life. The album revealed a woman who had not only built wealth but had engaged with the world in ways that reflected her intelligence, curiosity, and expertise. It showed a life rich in experiences, relationships, and accomplishments that had nothing to do with family approval or social acceptance. "I feel like I don't know you at all," Sophie said quietly. "You know me," I assured her. "You know the grandmother who loves you, who wants the best for you, who would do anything to help you succeed. That hasn't changed. What's changed is that you now know I'm capable of much more than anyone gave me credit for." We moved to the dining room for dinner, where I'd prepared a meal that showcased not only my cooking skills but my ability to create an atmosphere of warmth and abundance. The conversation over dinner was different from any we'd shared before. Instead of polite small talk punctuated by awkward silences, we engaged in substantive discussions about money, values, and future plans. "Dad told us about the new house," Tyler said as we enjoyed the main course. "And about the business you're helping him start." "I'm not helping him start it," I clarified. "I'm funding it, but he's going to run it. There's a difference. Your father has excellent skills and knowledge about finance. He just needs to learn to apply them more wisely." Marcus looked uncomfortable but didn't argue. "I've been thinking about what you said about the difference between appearing wealthy and building wealth. I think I finally understand." "Explain it to me," I requested. "Appearing wealthy means spending money to impress people. Building wealth means making choices that increase your financial security over time, even if those choices don't look impressive to others. Very good. And which approach do you think serves a family better in the long run? Building wealth, Emma answered before Marcus could respond. Because if you're just appearing wealthy, you're actually getting poorer, right? Exactly right. Emma, you clearly understand money better than many adults. Madison had been quiet throughout most of the meal, but finally spoke up. Bernice, can I ask you something personal? Of course. When you were making all this money, building your portfolio, why didn't you upgrade your lifestyle at all? Why did you keep living like you were struggling? It was a fair question, one I'd asked myself many times over the years. Several reasons, I said thoughtfully. First, I wanted to be absolutely sure my investments were sound before I started depending on them. Second, I wanted to understand the difference between having money and needing to spend it. But most importantly, I wanted to see how people treated me when they thought I had nothing to offer them except love and companionship. Madison's face flushed. And we failed that test. It wasn't a test, Madison. It was just reality. And yes, you did show me exactly how you valued relationships based on perceived social and economic status. I'm so sorry. I know you are. But I need you to understand something crucial. Apologizing isn't enough. You need to change how you think about people, about money, about what really matters in life. Tyler leaned forward, clearly engaged in the conversation. Grandma, what should we have been doing differently? You personally didn't do anything wrong, Tyler. You're children, and you behaved the way your parents taught you to behave. But, going forward, I want you to remember that a person's worth has nothing to do with their bank account, their possessions, or their social status. What does it have to do with? Sophie asked. Character. Kindness. Integrity. How they treat people who can't do anything for them. How they handle responsibility. How they contribute to making the world better rather than just making themselves look better. Marcus set down his fork and looked directly at me. Mom, I want you to know that I understand now. Not just about the money, but about how we treated you. How I let Madison exclude you from things. How I went along with the assumption that you weren't sophisticated enough for our social circle. And what are you going to do differently? Everything, he said simply. We're selling the house, downsizing, getting our finances in order. But more than that, we're going to start making decisions based on what's actually good for our family, not what looks good to other people. After dinner, we moved back to the living room for dessert and coffee. As the afternoon progressed, I noticed something beautiful happening. For the first time in years, we were having genuine conversations. The children asked thoughtful questions about investing, about career choices, about the difference between needs and wants. Marcus and Madison engaged in honest discussions about their financial mistakes and their plans for recovery. Most importantly, I felt respected. Not feared because of my wealth, not pitted because of my perceived poverty, but respected as an intelligent, capable woman whose opinions and experiences had value. As evening approached, Tyler asked if he could speak with me privately. We stepped onto the balcony, where the city lights were beginning to twinkle against the darkening sky. Grandma, I want to apologize for something. What's that, sweetheart? For not paying attention. For not noticing that you were more interesting, more accomplished, more everything than we gave you credit for. I feel like I missed out on really knowing you because I assumed you were just a typical grandmother. His honesty touched me deeply. Tyler, you didn't miss out. We have plenty of time to get to know each other better. But I want you to learn something from this experience. What? Never assume you know everything about someone based on surface appearances. Your grandmother who seems poor might be rich. Your classmate who seems confident might be struggling. Your teacher who seems strict might be deeply caring. People are complex, and if you take time to really see them, really listen to them, you'll discover wonderful things you never expected. Is that why you invest so well? Because you see things other people miss? I smiled at his perceptiveness. Partly, yes. Good investing requires looking beyond the obvious, understanding the real value of things rather than just their current price. It's a skill that applies to people as well as stocks. When we rejoined the family inside, Madison approached me with obvious nervousness. Bernice, Marcus and I have been talking, and we want to ask you something. Go ahead. Would you consider being more involved in the children's lives? Not just as their grandmother, but as someone who could teach them about financial responsibility, about making good decisions, about seeing the world more clearly? What exactly are you asking? Marcus joined the conversation. We're asking if you'd help us raise them differently than we've been doing. With better values, better understanding of money, better appreciation for substance over appearance. I looked at Tyler, Emma, and Sophie, 3 young people who had the potential To learn from their parents' mistakes rather than repeat them. I would be honored, I said. But I have conditions. Of course, Madison said quickly. First, no more pretending. About money, about struggles, about success. We're going to be honest with each other, even when it's uncomfortable. Agreed. Second, the children need to understand that respect isn't something you give people based on their wealth or status. It's something you give people because they're human beings with dignity and worth. Absolutely. Third, we're going to talk openly about the choices that led to your financial problems, and about the choices that will lead to financial security. Not to shame anyone, but to learn from experience. Marcus nodded. That's exactly what we want. I turned to the children. And you three need to understand that your lives are going to change. You're not going to live in the big house anymore. You're not going to have luxury cars or expensive clothes or private school tuition. But you are going to have something much more valuable. What's that? Emma asked. Security. Honesty. Parents who aren't stressed about money all the time. And a grandmother who can help you understand how to build real wealth rather than just the appearance of wealth. Sophie clapped her hands together. I think this is going to be so much better. As the evening wound down and my family prepared to leave, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years, hope for our relationships. Not the desperate hope I'd carried for so long that they would accept me despite my perceived limitations. But confident hope that we could build something genuine together. Madison lingered as the others headed to the elevator. Bernice, there's something else I need to say. What's that? I've been thinking about Emma's phone call to you. About how I used her to reach out because I was too proud to call myself. That was wrong, and I'm ashamed of it. It was wrong, I agreed. Children shouldn't be messengers for adult conflicts. I want you to know that I understand now. Not just about money, but about character. About the kind of person I want to be, the kind of mother I want to be, the kind of daughter-in-law I want to be. Madison, I don't need you to be perfect. I just need you to be real. She hugged me then, and for the first time, it felt genuine rather than obligatory. After they left, I stood in my beautiful apartment, looking out at the city where I'd spent my entire adult life. The woman who had served coffee to executives was now wealthier than most of them. The widow who had been dismissed as irrelevant was now a respected investor and businesswoman. The mother who had been excluded from family gatherings was now the center of a healing family. But the most important transformation wasn't financial. It was personal. I had stopped allowing other people's assumptions to define my reality. I had stopped making myself smaller to make others more comfortable. I had stopped apologizing for my success and started embracing it. The next morning, I received a text from Tyler. Grandma, thank you for yesterday. It was the best Christmas we've had in years. Not because of the apartment or the food, but because it felt real. Love you. A few hours later, Emma sent her own message. I've been thinking about what you said about seeing people clearly. I want to learn how to do that. Can you teach me? And then Sophie, Mom and Dad are looking at the new house today. I'm excited. It feels like we're finally going to be ourselves instead of pretending to be someone else. Each message reminded me that healing a family isn't about money, though money can certainly be a tool for healing. It's about honesty, respect, and the willingness to grow from mistakes rather than repeat them. 2 weeks later, Marcus called with an update on their transition. They had successfully sold the Willowbrook house, paying off most of their debts and freeing themselves from the financial pressure that had been consuming their lives. They had moved into the house I'd purchased for them, and the children were already adapting to their new school district. Mom, I can't tell you how different it feels, Marcus said. Madison and I haven't fought about money once since we moved. The kids are actually happier in a smaller house with a backyard they can play in without worrying about disturbing the neighbors. And the business? I'm meeting with my first clients next week. 3 families who are in similar situations to where we were. People who are drowning in debt but too proud to admit they need help. Perfect. You'll be able to speak from experience about the difference between image and substance. There's something else, Mom. Madison wants to go back to work. She's been out of the workforce for 12 years, but she has a background in marketing, and she thinks she can help with the business. What do you think about that? I think it's a great idea. She understands better than anyone how easy it is to get caught up in appearances. She could help other women recognize the warning signs before they get in too deep. The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, with Marcus sharing details about their new life, their improved relationship, and their children's adjustment to different expectations and opportunities. After we hung up, I realized that the gift I'd given my family wasn't really the house or the business funding or even the educational trusts for the children. The real gift was the truth. The truth about money, about values, about the difference between appearing successful and actually being successful. But perhaps more importantly, I had given myself a gift, the freedom to be who I really was, to live according to my own values rather than others' expectations, to use my resources and abilities without apology or pretense. That evening, I attended a charity gala for the first time as an openly wealthy woman rather than as someone hiding her financial status. I wore a gown that cost more than I used to spend on clothes in a year, jewelry that reflected my actual rather than assumed budget, and confidence that came from finally living authentically. At the gala, I was seated at a table with other major donors, business leaders, and community figures. For the first time in 15 years, I was in my element rather than pretending to be comfortable in someone else's. During the cocktail hour, a woman approached me with obvious curiosity. "I don't think we've met," she said. "I'm Patricia Morrison. From Morrison Financial. Are you new to Chicago?" "Not new to the city," I replied. "But perhaps new to this particular social circle. I'm Bernie Kelly." "Kelly. Kelly." She looked thoughtful. "Wait, are you the Bernie Kelly who's been making waves in pharmaceutical investments? The woman who identified the breakthrough treatments for Alzheimer's before anyone else saw their potential?" "I've made some successful investments in medical research, yes." Her eyes widened. "You're legendary among women investors. There are articles about your portfolio performance, your ability to spot undervalued companies with strong leadership. Where have you been hiding?" "I haven't been hiding," I said with a smile. "I've been living quietly while learning loudly." That night, as I drove home in my Mercedes through the Chicago streets I'd traveled for decades, I reflected on the journey that had brought me to this point. The shy secretary who had married young and devoted herself to her husband's career. The widow who had discovered financial independence. The mother who had been dismissed by her own family. The woman who had chosen authenticity over acceptance. Each phase had been necessary, had taught me something essential about myself and about the world. But this phase, the one where I finally lived as my whole self without apology or pretense, felt like coming home to a person I'd always been but never had the courage to be. When I arrived at my penthouse, I found a handwritten note that had been slipped under my door. It was from Mrs. Patterson, my former neighbor. "Dear Bernie, I heard from Marcus that you moved to a fancy apartment downtown. I wanted you to know that I'll miss our conversations over the garden fence, and I'll miss bringing you soup when you seemed lonely. But I'm not sad for you. I'm happy that you're finally living the life you deserve. You were always too special for that little house, though you made it beautiful while you were there. Much love, Dorothy." The note brought tears to my eyes, not from sadness but from the recognition that some people had always seen me clearly, regardless of my financial status or social position. Mrs. Patterson had valued my friendship when she thought I was struggling, and she was happy for my success now that she knew the truth. These were the relationships worth preserving, the ones based on genuine connection rather than perceived utility. As I prepared for bed in my beautiful bedroom overlooking Lake Michigan, I felt a deep sense of satisfaction that had nothing to do with revenge or vindication. I had spent 15 years building wealth in secret, and that wealth had given me options and security. But more importantly, I had spent those years building character, knowledge, and the confidence to live as my authentic self. Tomorrow would bring new opportunities to use my resources wisely, to help my family continue healing, to support causes I believed in, and to mentor other women who might be discovering their own strength later in life. But tonight, I was simply content to be Bernie Kelly, grandmother, investor, woman of substance, finally living without masks or pretense or apology. Finally home in my own skin, in my own life, in my own truth. 3 months after Christmas, I stood in the offices of Kelly Financial Consulting, watching Marcus explain debt consolidation strategies to a young couple who reminded me of him and Madison 5 years earlier. The husband wore an expensive suit that probably cost more than their monthly grocery budget, while the wife clutched a designer handbag that likely represented a month's worth of car payments. They nodded earnestly as Marcus outlined the harsh realities of their financial situation, their faces reflecting the same mixture of shame and relief I'd seen in my son's eyes when he'd first admitted their troubles. The business was thriving beyond our most optimistic projections. Word had spread quickly through Chicago's professional community about a financial counselor who had personally experienced and overcome catastrophic debt. Marcus's combination of legal expertise, financial knowledge, and hard-earned wisdom about the psychology of overspending made him uniquely qualified to help families trapped in cycles of financial pretense. The first step, Marcus was saying to his clients, is distinguishing between what you need and what you think you need. That car payment might feel necessary, but transportation is necessary. The specific car is a choice. I smiled from my position near the window, remembering similar conversations I'd had with Marcus about his own choices. The transformation in my son over the past few months had been remarkable. Gone was the stressed, defensive man who'd worked endless hours to maintain an unsustainable lifestyle. In his place was someone focused, purposeful, and genuinely helpful to others facing similar challenges. Madison entered the office carrying coffee and a stack of files. She joined the business 6 weeks earlier, initially handling administrative tasks but quickly proving herself invaluable as a client liaison. Her personal experience with the emotional aspects of financial denial made her particularly effective at helping other women recognize their own patterns of magical thinking about money. Mrs. Rodriguez called, Madison said quietly, approaching my desk. She wanted to thank you again for the scholarship fund. Her daughter got into Northwestern, and the financial aid package covers everything. The scholarship fund had been one of my first major philanthropic projects after revealing my wealth. I'd established it specifically for children of families who were rebuilding their finances after bankruptcy, divorce, or other financial setbacks. The fund covered not just tuition but also provided mentorship and financial literacy education to ensure the recipients understood the value of what they were receiving. How many applicants do we have for next year? I asked. 47 so far, and the deadline isn't for another month. We might need to expand the program. Good problem to have. Madison hesitated, then sat down across from my desk. Bernice, can I ask you something personal? Of course. How did you know? When you were building your portfolio, making all those successful investments, how did you know they would work out? It was a question I'd been asked frequently over the past few months, both by clients of the business and by other investors who'd learned about my track record. I didn't know, I said honestly. But I did my research. I spent hours studying companies, reading financial reports, understanding market trends. I never invested in anything I didn't understand, and I never put all my money in one place. But there's more to it than that, isn't there? Marcus says you have intuition about people, about whether a company's leadership is trustworthy. Experience, I corrected. 37 years of watching people make decisions under pressure. You learn to recognize competence, integrity, and genuine vision versus desperation, deception, and wishful thinking. Madison nodded thoughtfully. I've been thinking about going back to school. Getting an MBA, maybe specializing in financial planning. I want to understand this world the way you do. What's stopping you? Time, mostly. Money, partly. I'm 45, Bernice. Most of my classmates would be young enough to be my children. And that matters because? Because I feel like I'm starting over so late in life. Like I wasted 15 years trying to appear successful instead of actually becoming competent. I leaned back in my chair, studying the woman who had once dismissed me as irrelevant to her sophisticated world. Madison's transformation had been even more dramatic than Marcus's in some ways. She'd gone from someone who measured her worth by her possessions to someone genuinely interested in developing skills and knowledge. Madison, I started seriously investing when I was 61. I didn't speak at my first financial conference until I was 68. I didn't feel confident calling myself a businesswoman until I was 70. There's no expiration date on growth. But you had advantages. You had money to invest. You had Frank's foundation to build on. I had advantages, I agreed. But not the ones you think. My biggest advantage was that nobody expected anything from me. I could make mistakes without damaging my reputation because I didn't have a reputation to protect. I could ask naive questions because people assumed I was naive anyway. Madison smiled ruefully. Whereas I have to overcome everyone's memories of me as the woman who bought a $60,000 car while complaining about grocery bills. Exactly. But that's not necessarily a disadvantage. You understand the psychology of financial self-deception better than someone who's never experienced it. You can help people because you've been where they are. Is that why you're funding the business? To help people avoid the mistakes we made? Partly. But also because I believe in second chances. I believe people can change, can learn, can become better versions of themselves if they're willing to do the work. Our conversation was interrupted by Tyler, who'd started working at the office part-time while attending community college. At 19, he'd surprised everyone by choosing practical education over the prestigious university track his parents had always assumed he'd follow. Grandma Bernie, the reporter from the Tribune is here for your interview. I'd recently agreed to a profile in the Chicago Tribune about late-in-life financial success, though I'd insisted the focus be on education and empowerment rather than personal wealth. The journalist, Sarah Chen, was particularly interested in the growing trend of older women taking control of their financial lives after divorce or widowhood. Send her in, Tyler. And would you mind staying? I'd like you to hear this conversation. Sarah Chen was a sharp-eyed woman in her 30s who'd clearly done her homework. She'd researched my investment history, spoken with other women investors, and even tracked down some of my former colleagues from my secretary days. Mrs. Kelly, thank you for agreeing to this interview. I have to admit, your story is fascinating. A secretary who becomes a millionaire investor, but lives in a modest house for 15 years while her family thinks she's struggling financially. It sounds almost like fiction. Truth often does, I replied. But I hope you'll focus less on the wealth accumulation and more on the principles behind it. Absolutely. But I'm curious about the family dynamics. Your son and daughter-in-law had no idea about your financial success? I glanced at Tyler, who nodded encouragingly. We discussed how much to share publicly, and he'd urged me to be completely honest. They saw what they expected to see, I said. I made choices about how to live, how to spend, how to present myself to the world. They interpreted those choices through their own assumptions about age, class, and capability. You're being diplomatic. From what I understand, they excluded you from family events and treated you as a financial burden while you were actually wealthier than they were. That's accurate, I admitted. But I enabled that dynamic by not correcting their assumptions. I was as responsible as they were for the misunderstanding. Tyler spoke up. Can I add something to that? Sarah nodded. My grandmother is being kind, but the truth is that my parents and I learned some hard lessons about how we judge people. We thought we knew everything about Grandma Bernie based on surface appearances. We were wrong about almost everything. How has that changed your family relationships? Completely, Tyler said without hesitation. We talk about real things now instead of just being polite. We make decisions based on what's actually good for us instead of what looks good to other people. And we listen to Grandma Bernie instead of just tolerating her. Sarah turned back to me. Mrs. Kelly, what advice would you give to other women who might be in similar situations? Women who are underestimated or dismissed by their families? Stop waiting for permission to be who you are, I said immediately. Stop making yourself smaller to make others more comfortable. And stop assuming that other people's opinions about your capabilities are more accurate than your own knowledge of yourself. That sounds like hard-won wisdom. It is. I spent too many years allowing other people's assumptions to limit my choices. I thought I was being kind, being accommodating, being a good mother and grandmother. But really, I was being dishonest. With everyone, including myself. Tyler leaned forward. Can I tell her about the Christmas dinner? I nodded. The first Christmas after Grandma Bernie revealed the truth about her finances, she hosted dinner at her new penthouse apartment. It was the first time our family had ever had completely honest conversations about money, about values, about what really matters. Sarah was taking notes rapidly. What made those conversations different? Nobody was pretending anymore, Tyler explained. My parents weren't pretending to be more successful than they were. Grandma Bernie wasn't pretending to be struggling. We could finally talk about real problems and real solutions. And what were the real problems? Madison had entered the office during the interview and now spoke up. The real problem was that we'd confused image with substance. We'd borrowed money to buy things that made us look successful while actually making us financially vulnerable. And we dismissed the one person in our family who actually understood how to build security. Sarah looked intrigued. Mrs. Madison Kelly, you're Marcus's wife? I am. And I was the primary driver of our financial problems. I was also the person who treated Bernice most poorly because her modest lifestyle embarrassed me. How do you feel about that now? Madison was quiet for a moment. Ashamed. Grateful. Determined to do better. Bernice didn't just help us financially, she helped us understand the difference between living well and living beyond our means. The interview continued for another hour, covering topics from investment strategies to family dynamics to the psychology of financial decision-making. Throughout the conversation, I was struck by how naturally Tyler and Madison participated, how comfortable they'd become discussing topics that would have been taboo in our family just months earlier. After Sarah left, Madison approached me with obvious nervousness. Bernice, I have something to tell you, and I'm not sure how you'll react. Go ahead. I've been accepted to Northwestern's Executive MBA program. Part-time, designed for working professionals. It starts in the fall. I felt a surge of pride and pleasure. Madison, that's wonderful news. Congratulations. The thing is, it's expensive. Really expensive. And even though we're in a better financial position now, it would be a stretch for our budget. Are you asking me to pay for it? No, she said quickly. I'm asking if you think it's a wise investment. If you think I should take on debt for education, given everything we've learned about debt. It was a thoughtful question, the kind of nuanced financial decision that required balancing risk, potential return, and personal circumstances. What's your goal with the MBA? To become genuinely competent in financial planning and business management. To contribute more meaningfully to this business and maybe eventually start my own practice helping women who are rebuilding their financial lives. And you've researched the program thoroughly? You understand the time commitment, the opportunity costs, the likelihood of achieving your goals? I've done my homework, Madison said. I've talked to alumni, reviewed the curriculum, calculated the potential return on investment. I believe it's worth doing, but I want to do it responsibly. I considered her request carefully. Madison's transformation over the past few months had been genuine and sustained. She'd thrown herself into learning about finance, had become an asset to the business, and had shown real aptitude for helping other families navigate financial challenges. I think it's an excellent investment, I said finally. And I'd like to fund it. Madison's eyes widened. Bernice, I can't accept that. You've already done so much for our family. You're not accepting charity, Madison. You're accepting an investment in your education and your future contributions to this business. Consider it a business expense. But what if I don't succeed? What if I'm not as capable as I think I am? Then you'll have learned something valuable about yourself and about business, and that knowledge will still be useful. But Madison, I don't think you'll fail. I've watched you work with our clients. You have natural instincts for this field. And you have life experience that can't be taught in a classroom. Tyler, who'd been listening to our conversation, spoke up. Grandma Bernie, can I ask you something about college? Of course. I've been thinking about transferring to a 4-year school, maybe majoring in finance or business administration. But I'm wondering if it's worth the debt, especially since I'm already learning so much working here. It was another thoughtful question from a young man who'd learned to think critically about financial decisions rather than just assuming that more expensive education was automatically better. What are your career goals, Tyler? I want to understand business and finance the way you do. I want to help families make better financial decisions. But I also want to understand investments, maybe eventually help manage portfolios for people. Those are good goals. And there are multiple paths to achieving them. Traditional college education, professional certifications, apprenticeships, self-directed learning. The question is which combination will serve your specific goals most effectively. What would you recommend? I'd recommend finishing your associate's degree, then working here full-time for a year while taking finance courses online. Get some real-world experience before committing to expensive university programs. Learn what aspects of the business you're naturally good at and which areas need more development. Tyler nodded thoughtfully. That makes sense. Get practical experience while I figure out exactly what I want to specialize in. Exactly. And Tyler, remember that education is an ongoing process. I'm still taking courses, still learning new things about investing and business management. The goal isn't to finish your education, it's to make your education work for your goals. Emma arrived at the office after school, a routine she'd established since her parents started working there. At 16, she'd become fascinated by the financial planning process and often sat in on client meetings when appropriate. How was school? Madison asked. Boring, Emma replied. We're studying economics, but the teacher doesn't understand basic investment principles. She told the class that stocks are gambling and that savings accounts are the safest way to build wealth. I winced. What did you tell her? I explained the difference between investing and speculating, and I showed her some articles about how inflation erodes the value of money sitting in low-interest savings accounts. She said I was being disrespectful. Madison sighed. Emma, you need to be more diplomatic when you correct adults. But Mom, she's teaching wrong information. If the other kids believe her, they'll make bad financial decisions for their whole lives. Emma's right about the information being wrong, I said. But Madison's right about the diplomacy. Emma, you can share accurate information without making your teacher feel stupid or challenged. How? Ask questions instead of making statements. Instead of telling her she's wrong about stocks, ask her to explain the difference between diversified index funds and individual stock picking. Instead of correcting her about savings accounts, ask her to discuss the historical relationship between savings account interest rates and inflation rates. Emma considered this. So I help her teach herself the right information instead of just telling her she's wrong? Exactly. People learn better when they discover things for themselves rather than being corrected by someone else. That's actually a good business principle too, Marcus added, joining our conversation. When I work with clients, I don't tell them their financial choices are stupid. I ask them questions that help them recognize the problems themselves. Speaking of clients, Madison said, we have a new consultation tomorrow. A family that's considering bankruptcy, but they want to explore other options first. What's their situation? I asked. 2 parents, 3 children. Combined income of about 90,000, but debt of over 200,000. Credit cards, student loans, car payments, medical bills from when the father was unemployed. And they lost their health insurance. Sounds familiar, Marcus said grimly. The difference is that their debt came from genuine hardship rather than lifestyle inflation, Madison observed. They didn't buy luxury items they couldn't afford. They went into debt trying to survive a financial crisis. That's actually harder to resolve in some ways, I said. When debt comes from overspending on luxuries, you can solve the problem by changing spending habits. When debt comes from survival expenses, the underlying issues are more complex. What would you recommend for a family like that? Emma asked. First, stop the bleeding. Make sure they're not adding new debt while they deal with existing debt. Second, prioritize the debts by consequences. Mortgage and car payments first. If they need the house and transportation to maintain income. Third, negotiate with creditors for reduced payments or settlements. What if the creditors won't negotiate? Tyler asked. Then you look at legal options. Chapter 13 bankruptcy might allow them to reorganize their debts without losing their house or cars. It's not ideal, but it's better than losing everything. Madison looked thoughtful. I keep thinking about how different our situation was. We had options because our debt came from poor choices rather than bad luck. This family might not have the same flexibility. That's why this work is important, Marcus said. Every family situation is different. Every solution has to be tailored to specific circumstances. As evening approached, the family began closing up the office and preparing to head home. It had become our routine to spend a few minutes at the end of each day discussing what we'd learned, what challenges we'd faced, and what we wanted to accomplish tomorrow. Before we leave, I said, I want to share something with all of you. They gathered around my desk, curious. 6 months ago, our family was fractured. Marcus and Madison were drowning in debt. The children were learning dangerous lessons about money and relationships. I was living a lie that protected everyone's feelings but served no one's interests. It feels like a different lifetime, Madison said softly. It was a different lifetime. But what I want you to understand is that none of this healing would have been possible if we hadn't been willing to face hard truths about ourselves and our choices. What do you mean? Emma asked. I mean that change requires honesty. Real change, lasting change, meaningful change. It requires admitting when we've been wrong, accepting responsibility for our mistakes, and committing to different choices going forward. Tyler nodded. Like when you finally told us the truth about your money instead of letting us keep treating you badly. Exactly. And like when your parents admitted their financial problems instead of continuing to pretend everything was fine. Marcus spoke up. Mom, I want you to know that this business, this new life we're building, it's not just about money. It's about becoming the kind of people we want to be instead of pretending to be people we're not. That's exactly right. And that's why I think this business will succeed long term. Because we're not just helping people with financial problems, we're helping them understand the relationship between honesty and security. As we prepared to leave, Emma approached me with a question she'd clearly been considering all day. Grandma Bernie, do you ever regret not telling us the truth sooner? Do you wish you'd revealed your wealth years ago instead of waiting until things got so bad? It was a profound question, one I'd asked myself many times over the past few months. I regret the time we lost, I said honestly. I regret the relationship we could have had if I'd been more authentic and if your parents had been more open to seeing me as I really was. But I don't regret the lessons we all learned from the experience. What lessons? You learned that people are more complex than they appear on the surface. Your parents learned the difference between image and substance. I learned that hiding who you are never serves anyone well in the long run. Emma hugged me tightly. I'm glad we know the real you now. I'm glad too, sweetheart. And I'm glad we're building something real together instead of just going through the motions of being a family. As I drove home that evening to my penthouse apartment, I reflected on how much had changed and how much remained constant. The view from my windows was spectacular, my furnishings were luxurious, my financial security was absolute. But the most important changes weren't material. I was finally living as my whole self, using my resources and abilities without apology or concealment. My family relationships were based on mutual respect rather than assumptions and pretense. My daily work involved helping others learn lessons I'd gained through decades of experience. Most importantly, I'd learned that authenticity wasn't just about being honest with others, it was about being honest with yourself about what you're capable of, what you deserve, and what you're willing to accept from the people in your life. The woman who had served coffee and taken dictation for 37 years had always been capable of building wealth and running businesses. The widow who had seemed helpless and dependent had always been strong and resourceful. The grandmother who had been dismissed as irrelevant had always been wise and insightful. The only thing that had changed was my willingness to let those qualities show. 2 years later, I stood on the stage of the Chicago Convention Center, looking out at an audience of 800 women who had gathered for the annual Financial Independence After 50 conference. The woman introducing me was Patricia Hendricks, the pharmaceutical CEO whose company had been one of my most successful investments, and she was describing my journey from secretarial work to financial independence with an enthusiasm that still surprised me. Bernie Kelly represents something revolutionary in our understanding of late-life potential, Patricia was saying. She proves that reinvention isn't just possible after retirement, it can be more successful than anything you accomplished in your so-called prime years. As I walked to the podium, I caught sight of Madison and Emma in the third row, both beaming with pride. Madison had graduated from Northwestern's MBA program with honors and had just opened her own practice specializing in financial recovery for divorced and widowed women. Emma, now 18 and headed to college on an academic scholarship she'd earned entirely through her own merit, had become something of a financial literacy advocate among her peers. "Thank you, Patricia," I began, my voice carrying clearly through the auditorium. 2.5 years ago, most people who knew me would have been shocked to see me on the stage. Not because I wasn't capable of being here, but because I hadn't given them any reason to believe I was. The audience was attentive, leaning forward slightly as I continued. I spent 15 years building substantial wealth while allowing everyone around me, including my own family, to believe I was financially struggling. I made that choice for what seemed like good reasons at the time, but I learned that hiding your capabilities serves no one well. A hand shot up in the audience. "Mrs. Kelly, why did you choose to keep your success secret?" "Because I was afraid that success would change how people treated me, and I wanted to be valued for who I was rather than what I had." The irony is that by hiding my success, I allowed people to undervalue me anyway, just for different reasons. Another woman called out, "How did your family react when they discovered the truth?" I smiled, thinking of the chaos and revelation of that Thanksgiving dinner that had changed everything. With shock, shame, and eventually gratitude. But the real lesson wasn't about their reaction to my wealth. It was about how we'd all allowed assumptions to replace real communication, how we'd chosen comfortable lies over difficult truths. For the next hour, I shared the practical aspects of my investment strategy, the emotional journey of late-life reinvention, and the family dynamics that had both hindered and ultimately supported my growth. But as I reached the conclusion of my presentation, I found myself focusing on something deeper. "The most important thing I want you to understand," I said to the audience, "is that your current circumstances, whatever they are, don't define your future possibilities. Whether you're 50, 60, 70, or beyond, whether you're starting with a modest savings account or significant assets, whether your family supports your ambitions or dismisses them, you have the power to change your financial reality." A woman near the back raised her hand. "But what if we make mistakes? What if we're not as smart about investing as you were?" "I made plenty of mistakes," I assured her. "I lost money on investments that looked promising but failed. I trusted financial advisors who were more interested in commissions than my success. I bought stocks based on tips from friends rather than research. The difference between success and failure isn't perfection, it's persistence and continuous learning." After the presentation, during the networking reception, I was approached by dozens of women with their own stories of late-life discovery, family challenges, and financial aspirations. Each conversation reminded me of how many people were living smaller lives than their capabilities warranted, often because they'd accepted other people's limitations as their own. Dr. Janet Morrison, a recently retired pediatrician, told me about the real estate empire she'd been building quietly while her colleagues assumed she was just planning a modest retirement. "My ex-husband used to say I was too impractical to handle money," she said. "Turns out I'm better at it than he ever was." Maria Santos, a former factory worker, described the online business she'd started at 62, selling handmade crafts to customers around the world. "My children thought I was too old to learn computers," she laughed. "Now I make more money than my daughter who works in IT." Story after story of women who had discovered or rediscovered their capabilities after being underestimated, dismissed, or pigeonholed by families, employers, or society at large. As the evening wound down, I found myself in conversation with a group of financial planners who worked specifically with older women. They were discussing the unique challenges their clients faced: adult children who wanted to control their finances, social expectations about age-appropriate activities, and their own internalized beliefs about what they were supposed to do at various life stages. "The hardest part," one planner said, "is convincing women that it's not too late to take risks, to try new things, to build something significant." "It's not about age," I replied. It's about mindset. I know 30-year-olds who think they're too old to change careers and 80-year-olds who are starting new businesses. The question isn't whether you have enough time left, it's whether you're willing to use the time you have. When I finally returned to my penthouse that evening, I found Marcus waiting in my living room with a bottle of champagne and a stack of legal documents. "We did it, Mom," he said, his face glowing with excitement. Kelly Financial Consulting has been selected as the preferred debt counseling service for 3 major employee assistance programs. We're going to help thousands of families get their finances back on track. I hugged my son, feeling the satisfaction that comes not from personal achievement but from watching someone you love discover their own potential. "Tell me about the contracts," I said as we settled into my living room with our champagne. 18 months of guaranteed referrals, renewable based on client outcomes. The companies are specifically interested in our approach because we combine practical debt management with long-term wealth building strategies. And Madison's new practice? Booked solid for the next 6 months. She's got a waiting list of women who want help rebuilding their financial lives after divorce or widowhood. She's also been invited to speak at the National Association of Divorce Attorneys conference about the financial challenges women face during and after divorce proceedings. The pride in Marcus's voice when he talked about his wife's success was something I'd never heard during their years of financial pretense. When Madison had been focused on appearances and status, Marcus had seemed to view her more as an expensive accessory than as a partner. Now that she was building genuine competence and contributing meaningfully to their family's security, their relationship had transformed into something much more substantial. "What about the children?" I asked. "Tyler's been accepted into the financial planning certification program at DePaul. He'll graduate with both his bachelor's degree and his CFP credentials. Emma's scholarship to Northwestern is confirmed, and she's planning to double major in business and psychology. And Sophie?" Marcus grinned. "Sophie has started a financial literacy club at her middle school. She's teaching other 13-year-olds about budgeting, saving, and the difference between needs and wants. The school district is so impressed they're asking her to develop a curriculum for other schools." My youngest granddaughter had absorbed the lessons of our family's transformation more deeply than anyone. At 13, she understood money management principles that many adults never learned. More importantly, she understood that financial security came from wise choices rather than high income, from long-term thinking rather than immediate gratification. As Marcus and I talked late into the evening, I reflected on how completely our family dynamics had changed. 2 years earlier, our conversations had been polite, superficial, and strained. Marcus had seen me as a burden to be managed, a reminder of modest origins he preferred to forget. I had seen him as someone I loved but couldn't reach, someone who had chosen image over authenticity. Now we were business partners, intellectual equals, and genuine friends. We discussed investment strategies, client challenges, and family plans, with the kind of openness that had been missing from our relationship for decades. "Mom," Marcus said as he prepared to leave, "I need to ask you something, and I want you to be honest. Always. Do you ever resent us? For all those years when we treated you like you were irrelevant? For the way Madison excluded you from things? For how long it took us to see who you really were?" I considered the question carefully. "I don't resent you, Marcus. But I do regret the time we lost. I regret that it took a crisis to bring us together as authentic people rather than the roles we thought we were supposed to play." "What do you mean?" "I mean that for years, you played the role of the successful son, I played the role of the grateful mother, and Madison played the role of the sophisticated daughter-in-law. We were all performing instead of actually relating to each other." Marcus nodded slowly. "And now? Now we're just ourselves. Imperfect, honest, real. It's messy sometimes, but it's genuine." After Marcus left, I stood at my windows looking out at the city lights, thinking about the path that had brought me to this point. The journey from Frank's widow to successful businesswoman hadn't been linear or predictable. It had required patience, courage, and the willingness to keep learning even when the people around me had written me off as irrelevant. But the most important transformation hadn't been financial. It had been personal. I had stopped waiting for permission to be who I was. I had stopped making myself smaller to accommodate other people's expectations. I had stopped apologizing for my success and started using it purposefully. The next morning brought a call that would test everything I'd learned about family, money, and authenticity. Catherine, Madison's sister, was on the line, her voice tight with desperation. "Bernice, I hope you don't mind me calling. Madison gave me your number. I'm in serious trouble, and I don't know where else to turn." Catherine and her husband David had been among the guests at that disastrous Thanksgiving dinner 2 years earlier. They'd been politely dismissive of me then, clearly uncomfortable with Madison's poor mother-in-law's presence at their elegant gathering. What kind of trouble, Catherine? Financial trouble. David lost his job 3 months ago. And we've been trying to maintain our lifestyle while he looks for something new. We've maxed out our credit cards, borrowed against our 401k, even taken a second mortgage on the house. The pattern was achingly familiar. Another family choosing to go into debt rather than adjust their standard of living when their income dropped. What kind of help are you looking for? A loan. Just to get us through until David finds work. We can pay you back as soon as he's employed again. How much do you need? $52,000. I know it's a lot, but we're desperate. The mortgage payment is due next week, and if we miss it, we could lose the house. I was quiet for a long moment, remembering similar conversations with Marcus, remembering my own temptation to simply write checks that would solve immediate problems, without addressing underlying issues. Catherine, have you talked to a financial counselor? Someone who could help you restructure your debts and create a sustainable budget? We don't need a counselor. We just need to get through this rough patch. David will find work soon, and then everything will go back to normal. What if David's new job pays less than his previous one? What if it takes longer than you expect to find work? What if you have other unexpected expenses? Then we'll deal with those problems when they happen. Right now, we just need the loan. I understood Catherine's desperation, but I also understood that a loan without accompanying changes in behavior would only postpone the crisis rather than resolve it. I'm not going to give you $50,000, I said gently. But Bernice, we're family. Madison said you helped them when they were in trouble. I helped them rebuild their lives sustainably. I didn't just pay off their debts and hope for the best. What's the difference? The difference is that Marcus and Madison were willing to admit their lifestyle was unsustainable and make fundamental changes. They sold their expensive house, changed their spending habits, and committed to living within their means. Are you and David willing to do the same? Catherine was quiet for a long moment. We can't sell our house. David's career depends on his professional image. We need to live in the right neighborhood, drive the right cars, maintain our social connections. Then you're not ready for help, I said. You're asking me to fund the continuation of choices that created your problems in the first place. But we'll lose everything. You'll lose your illusions about what you can afford. That's not the same thing as losing everything. The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, with Catherine alternating between pleading and anger as she realized I wasn't going to provide the bailout she'd expected. When she finally hung up, frustrated and disappointed, I felt sad. But not guilty. I'd learned that helping people sometimes meant refusing to enable their destructive patterns, even when that refusal caused immediate pain. That afternoon, I called Madison to let her know about Catherine's request and my response. I'm not surprised, Madison said. Catherine and David have been living beyond their means for years. I think she assumed that because you helped us, you'd automatically help them too. How do you feel about my decision? Relieved, actually. If you'd just given them money, they wouldn't have learned anything. They'd be right back in the same situation as soon as the money ran out. It wasn't an easy conversation. I'm sure it wasn't. But Bernice, you taught us that real help sometimes looks like tough love. Sometimes the kindest thing you can do is refuse to make someone's bad choices easier. Madison's understanding of the situation showed how much her own relationship with money had matured. 2 years earlier, she would have expected me to solve Catherine's problems with a check. Now she understood that sustainable solutions required behavioral changes, not just financial resources. As my third year of Revealed Wealth progressed, I found myself increasingly involved in mentoring other women who were navigating late life financial challenges. Some were widows like I had been, discovering they needed to take control of finances their husbands had always managed. Others were divorced women starting over after years of financial dependence. Still others were women who had always worked but had never thought seriously about building wealth beyond basic retirement savings. Each woman's situation was unique, but I noticed common patterns: underestimating their own capabilities, overestimating the complexity of financial management, and accepting other people's limitations as their own. Eleanor Hartman was a perfect example. At 67, she'd been widowed for 5 years and was convinced she was too old to learn about investing. Her husband had left her comfortable but not wealthy, and she'd been keeping everything in savings accounts earning minimal interest because that's the safe thing to do. When Eleanor attended one of my workshops, she peppered me with questions that revealed both her intelligence and her self-doubt. Mrs. Kelly, what if I make a mistake and lose money? What if I'm not smart enough to understand the stock market? What if my children think I'm being reckless? Eleanor, I replied, what if you don't make any changes and inflation erodes the value of your savings over the next 20 years? What if you're smarter than you think you are? What if your children's opinions matter less than your financial security? 6 months later, Eleanor had moved a portion of her savings into a diversified portfolio of index funds and had started a small business making custom quilts for interior designers. She discovered not only that she could understand investing, but that she had a talent for identifying market trends and a passion for creating beautiful, functional art. "I wasted 5 years being afraid," she told me at our last meeting. 5 years of keeping my money in accounts that barely kept up with inflation because I thought investing was too complicated for someone like me. Stories like Eleanor's reminded me why revealing my own financial success had been necessary, despite the family upheaval it had caused. By hiding my capabilities, I had reinforced the assumption that women of my generation and background weren't capable of sophisticated financial decision-making. By living openly as a successful investor and businesswoman, I was helping to change those assumptions for other women. As my 4th year of Revealed Wealth began, I received an invitation that surprised me. The Chicago Business Hall of Fame wanted to induct me as an honorary member, recognizing my contributions to financial education and late-life entrepreneurship. The ceremony was held at the Palmer House Hotel, with an audience that included many of the city's most prominent business leaders. As I sat at the head table, wearing a gown that cost more than I used to spend on clothes in 5 years, I thought about the journey that had brought me to this moment. For years earlier, I had been seen as an elderly woman of limited means and modest aspirations. Tonight, I was being honored alongside CEOs, entrepreneurs, and business innovators who had shaped Chicago's economic landscape. When my name was called, I walked to the podium to address an audience that included my entire family, my business colleagues, and dozens of women whose lives had been touched by my story. When I started my career as a secretary in 1965, the idea that I would someday be inducted into this Hall of Fame would have seemed absurd. Not because I wasn't capable of achievement, but because society's expectations for women like me were so limited. I paused, looking out at the audience, seeing faces that reflected engagement rather than polite tolerance. I spent most of my life accepting other people's definitions of what I could accomplish, what I should want, and what was appropriate for someone of my age, gender, and background. It took me until my 70s to fully reject those limitations and start living according to my own assessment of my capabilities. The speech continued for 15 minutes, covering the themes I'd become known for: the importance of continuous learning, the danger of accepting artificial limitations, and the power of authentic relationships based on mutual respect rather than assumptions. As I concluded my remarks, I saw Tyler and Emma in the audience, both beaming with pride. Sophie, now 15 and already planning her own business ventures, was taking notes on everything I said. Marcus and Madison sat together, their faces reflecting not just pride but genuine admiration for the woman they'd finally learned to see clearly. "The most important lesson I want to leave you with," I said in closing, "is that your current circumstances are not your permanent reality. Whether you're 25 and feeling trapped in a dead-end job, 45 and facing unexpected financial challenges, or 65 and thinking your productive years are behind you, remember that growth is always possible. Change is always possible. Success, however you define it, is always possible." The standing ovation that followed felt like validation not just of my achievements, but of the choice to live authentically rather than according to others' expectations. After the ceremony, as my family and I celebrated at a private dinner, Sophie asked me a question that crystallized everything I'd learned over the past 4 years. "Grandma Bernie, do you think your life would have been different if you'd been confident about your abilities from the beginning instead of discovering them so late?" I considered her question carefully. Probably. I might have started investing sooner, might have been more ambitious in my career, might have demanded more respect from people who underestimated me. Do you wish things had been different? I wish I'd wasted less time accepting limitations that weren't real. But I don't regret the path I took, because it taught me things I couldn't have learned any other way. Like what? Like the difference between appearing successful and being successful. Like the importance of valuing people for who they are rather than what they seem to be. Like the power of patience and persistence in building something meaningful. Emma joined the conversation. "Grandma, what advice would you give to our generation? To people who are just starting their careers and their families?" Don't wait for permission to be who you are. Don't accept other people's limitations as your own. And remember that the most valuable things in life, the relationships and achievements that really matter, require honesty, patience, and authenticity. Tyler raised his glass. "To Grandma Bernie, who taught us that it's never too late to become who you're meant to be." As we toasted, I looked around the table at my family, these people who had learned to see me as I really was rather than as they expected me to be. Our relationships weren't perfect, but they were real. Our conversations weren't always easy, but they were honest. Our love wasn't based on convenience or obligation, but on genuine respect and appreciation for each other's authentic selves. The woman who had hidden her wealth for 15 years had finally learned that the most valuable thing you can share with people isn't your money, it's your truth. And the most important investment you can make isn't in stocks or bonds or real estate, it's in becoming the person you're capable of being, regardless of what anyone else thinks you should be. For years after that shattering Thanksgiving dinner, I had not only revealed my financial success but had used it as a foundation for building something much more valuable: authentic relationships, meaningful work, and a legacy based on empowering others to discover their own potential. The journey from hidden wealth to authentic living had been challenging, sometimes painful, but ultimately transformative. Not just for me, but for everyone whose life had been touched by my story. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.